Hi everyone, and welcome to this first virtual dialogue in the series being held on alcohol and cancer. This series is brought to you by the Union for International Cancer Control and the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, with very kind support today from the International Agency for Research on Cancer and the Public Health Association of Australia. For those of you who are new to us, UICC is a global membership organisation dedicated to uniting and supporting the cancer community to reduce the global cancer burden, promote greater equity, and ensure cancer control continues to be a priority on the World Health and Development agenda. The Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, or CPAC, is a pan-Canadian health organisation that works with partners across Canada to promote equitable access to quality cancer care and cancer prevention initiatives. On behalf of these two organisations and our fantastic guest speakers today, we wanted to welcome you to the session. And for those of you who are new to the virtual dialogues, these are being organised as a space where the cancer community can connect, exchange knowledge, access expert insights and share solutions. So over the course of the next hour or so, we're going to hear from Isabel Surjamataram and Terry Slevin, two of our expert speakers, who will walk us through the evidence base and hand it over to you all to pose your questions and share your insights. So I'm sure after the last 2 years, we're all very familiar with Zoom meetings, but a few quick housekeeping requests. Our conversation today will kick off with some comments from our two invited speakers. And during that session, part of the session, we'd invite you all to mute yourself. If you have any questions, please do pop these in the chat function or raise your hand at the end of the session when we get to the Q&A. The session is being recorded today, and all the recordings and the PowerPoint materials will be shared with you afterwards. And they'll also be hosted on uicc.org and the CPAC website, and so we'd encourage you to check back later for further materials. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, including any audio problems, or you're not able to see the slides, then please use the chat function or email advocacy@uicc.org. So without further ado, it's my pleasure today to introduce our two speakers, Isabel and Terry. Firstly, we'll start to hear from Dr. Isabel Surjamataram. I'm so sorry, Isabel, who is the Deputy Head of the Cancer Surveillance Branch at the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Isabel is an epidemiologist with a strong interest in cancer prevention through provision of data to inform cancer control activities. So, Isabel, thank you again for joining us. We very much appreciate it. And I'd like to sort of turn to you to kick off our conversation today. And I've got sort of three key questions. The first is, can you give us a little walkthrough around how alcohol is a risk factor for cancer? And then maybe touch a little bit on, what cancer types are the most closely associated with alcohol use, and actually how is this burden changing over time? So Isabel, I'll hand over to you with that small to-do list.
Thank you so much, Rosie, and thank you everyone for joining our this webinar. As mentioned by Rosie, this is a dialogue, so I'm hoping to hear from everybody, not only about your what you have been studying, what you have been looking at, but also then I can imagine then from the next presentation by Terry, also then on your experiences in terms of alcohol and cancer in your own countries or settings. So I hope that everybody can see my slides. I put this now into a large screen. So what I'll go through is then discussed just now by Rosie. I'll go a little bit on the alcohol and cancer relationship, how the history, a little bit on how that has been studied. And then at the end also then to look into then the population impact, how it has impact population at large in terms of cancer burden. So that will be then kind of the content of my presentation. But then before that, I would like to go into a little bit into alcohol drinking. How is the pattern of alcohol drinking in different countries? How is it then between men and women in region? And then I'll go even a little bit in terms of how it has changed over time, because what we know then of the past would really help us a lot in what we think might happen in the future. So if we're thinking of alcohol drinking, so this is data that we derived from the global repository of alcohol drinking. It's an estimate, and it's estimated based on 3 data sources, because some of the data sources, as you can imagine, can be biased. So first of the data, a lot of the data comes out then from surveys. So these are the national surveys usually that ask population on then a lot of different behaviors, including alcohol drinking. As mentioned, because it can be difficult in some countries to report on alcohol drinking or get good data on this, we also then triangulate the data with other informations. So for example, with alcohol sales. In some countries, it's not very useful because of different reasons, for example, tax of some items. But then this data is then also then compared in terms of the behavior, intake, consumption, how much people take, and then with what is then being sold in the country. The other database, that data that we looked into, is then a lot of countries also depending then on national laws of alcohol sales. There's home brewing. So then there's information on this. Now I'm thinking WHO has been trying then to collect this data using then their local WHO national consultants, and then try then to add that data, especially in countries where then there's a suspicion that there's a lot of that's going on. So this is then the overall data. So drinkers among the population, how drinkers are then defined. It is then people who has drank any amount of alcohol in the last 1 year. So this is a very light definition of alcohol drinking. And then if we are looking into then current drinkers and lifetime abstainers, the number is quite similar. So 46% of a population, now this is globally, reported alcohol drinking or estimated to have had a drink of alcohol within the last 12 months. And then another 46% are actually lifetime abstainers. So quite a big number as well. And then the rest of it, the last one, that's I made a mistake there, 9% is then the amount of people who quit drinking. So former drinkers. So they drank 12 months ago, before more than 12 months ago, and then this is then the number of people. If we think about it, thinking of the global adult population, this is around 3 to 2 billion people in each of these groups, the current and lifetime abstainers, so a lot of alcohol users globally. And then if we see how it changed the difference between men and women, there's a big difference. So among the current drinkers, those who are then estimated to be current drinkers are much more in men. And then this is true as well in terms of the amount of alcohol that being drunk. So men drink much more than women. Women then a bit less in terms of current drinkers, 38%. And then lifetime abstainers, there's much more women who abstain from alcohol drinking, while then the former drinkers are then in a way similar numbers. So if we're looking then, so we see that it's very different in terms of men and women. What is also very different is then where it is in the world. So most of the drinkers or countries or region where then the drinkers are highest is in the European countries. So you see then the proportion there in European countries among adults again. So 15 years and older can be as high as 78% of the whole population of adult populations had an alcohol drink within the last 12 months. The other region with high portion of the group of drinkers are then the Americas, North Americas especially, and also then in what is called the Western Pacific part of WHO, but especially in Australia, Japan, and South Korea. In the rest of the world, especially in North Africa and Western Asia, you see how context is then very important, but also environmental factors that at the end actually link either then to culture and policies. You see that in, for example, Northern African region and Western Asia, the level of alcohol drinking is very minimum, it's very small. And then there's also a lot of discussion that we have seen today that I'm not showing here, the decrease in alcohol drinkings. So in terms of alcohol drinkers in general, especially in countries where then it's been traditionally high, it's been going down. And this has been used for a lot of people who argue on the success of alcohol policies that you see and the decrease. But actually that's not, it's only half of the truth, because among those who drink, actually from the estimation, it's been shown that the amount of alcohol level or ethanol, total ethanol that is being drunk are actually increasing over time. And then there's some parts of the world, for example, like the Southeast Asian, where you actually see a real increase in terms of current drinkers as well. So that's a little bit about alcohol drinking globally. I'll go then through now on then the relationship between alcohol and cancer. Because traditionally or historically, alcohol at first in terms of health damages, it has been much more linked to, for example, accidents, abuse. The increased amount of level of alcohol has happened a lot during especially the wartime. And then there's then a lot of then different health damages or population damages that's linked to abuse, alcohol abuse happened during that time that push a lot of the policies. Alcohol and cancer has come in much later in terms of the history. It's new. So in IARC, we have then a group that looks into then and assess the relationship between a certain factor here, for example, alcohol and cancer, whether it's carcinogenic, whether it causes cancer or not in humans. And this is looked in different ways. So first it looked then into then animal studies, whether there are really proof in animal studies that the relationship between an agent, a substance and cancer. So here alcohol, it looks also into biological mechanism. There should be a mechanism that explains then the occurrence of cancer. And then at the end, it also looked into then the whole human studies that there's also a relationship there. So the first time alcohol was assessed systematically and then also then proclaimed or announced as being carcinogens is in 1988. A lot of the studies that come at that time are studies in human, for example, that happens around the 60s and the 70s, because the evidence need to grow before such an assessment can be done. And then at that time already, the cancer that was then really then announced to be carcinogens are a lot of cancers that are then on the upper part of the digestive system. So oral cavity, pharynx, larynx, and esophageal cancer. There's discussion then at that time already, and a lot of them look into then the studies in terms of colorectal cancer as well, liver cancer and breast cancer. But then at that time, the evidence is not strong enough for them to really say this is then there's a high level of relationship that we can observe at that moment. So then there's another project that has been going on for a while, and this is then led by WCRF, so the World Cancer Research Foundations, where then they put experts together, and this is then done continuously and at regular level, where then they update all then the informations as well then over time. And then this is then the time when then each of the cancer sites was then updated in terms of their information. The time when it's updated doesn't have to do at all with the level of the evidence, of course, but at the moment, we at least are quite sure or very sure of the relationship between alcohol and liver cancer. The evidence are very strong. Esophageal cancer, we saw also then a relationship between the different types or location of a cancer in the esophagus. Stomach cancer, I put the P there because actually the relationship starts to come up really strongly only among those who drink quite a lot of alcohol. Colorectal cancer, breast cancer, and then there's evidence for both among younger women with breast cancer and older women with breast cancer. And then, as mentioned before, mouth, pharynx, and laryngeal cancer. So then we recently did the report together with the WHO Euro region. There's a lot of interest at the moment at WHO region, especially in Europe, because of then part of it is because it's where alcohol is then consumed the most. There's a high level of meeting at the moment among the ministries where then alcohol then is put really into the focus of the discussions. And this is then part of that report that's published 2 years ago, if I'm not wrong, where then they put together again, really in strong languages. I'll show you at the end the relationship between these cancers and alcohol drinking. So this is a really nice graphic. I'm not going to go into the details of how alcohol and alcohol causes cancer. This is then a graphic that's showing one way, one mechanism how alcohol causes cancer that is then produced by Cancer Research UK. So ethanol is then the active part of alcohol. So within alcohol beverages, of course, there's water in it, there's ethanol. For some alcohol drinks, for example, like beers, there are some certain additional supplements, or then also, for example, some vitamins. There's also a high level of carbohydrate, for example, in beers as well. So there's different contents of alcohol drinks itself, but the element that causes cancer is the ethanol part. And then we know that alcohol drink and ethanol as a substance itself causes cancer. So ethanol is then produced within the body into something which is called acetaldehyde. So this is then the active substance that at the end causes the DNA damages, blocks DNA repairs or synthesis, causes also DNA methylation. But not only that, where then it passes by in terms of the cells, it causes inflammations, oxidative stress. And the last one that is now really a lot studies, it's then how it links with sex hormones. This is especially important for breast cancer, for which then the burden are actually quite big because it is one of the most common cancers around the world for women and men together, actually. The other point that I really want to bring out is then there is no safe limit. There's a lot of then discussion about what is then the level of alcohol that is then safe, that is then allowed to be drank in a population for cancer. There's no safe limits in terms of the magnitude, the amount of level of alcohol that you drink. We have been quite strong in terms of advocating for this. So even with the lowest amount of alcohol consumption, it has been then related to cancer. And then this is shown in this study. So I'm going to go through it a bit slowly here. So when we are doing these studies, what we with alcohol drinking and cancer, we compare people who reported drinking alcohol at different level of drinking alcohol. So the way this is reported here is by 10 grams per day. 10 grams per day is the amount of alcohol that is within one drinks, for example, 1 glass of beer or 1 glass of wine, for example. So this is the smallest, people usually smallest level of alcohol drinking that you can imagine. And then this is then also already putting all different kind of studies together. So the number of cases there are quite big, meaning that we are very certain or quite certain of then these relationships, as you can see here. So if the lines passes by 1, it means that, okay, it's not significant according to statistical estimation that it causes cancer. But as you can see here, even with the smallest amount of alcohol, a lot of the line doesn't touch us 1, And then it's even much larger than 1 for a lot of cancer sites, just for example, here, esophageal cancer. So those are then the relationship. It causes at least 7 cancer types. We can then put it into more depending on how you separate then those cancer sites. Some people then put head and neck cancer together, so then it becomes a lot of different cancer sites together. We often say that it's 7 cancer types because then we subdivide then those cancers, for example, oral, pharynx, and larynx as 3 separate cancer types. The relationship is quite strong, and then it can be even stronger depending, for example, if one smoke and then drink alcohol, the increase of risk is then 30 times higher. There's also no safe limit for cancer and alcohol drinking. So I'll go through very quickly how this then impact in terms of the population level. So this is what it's called, the proportion of cancer attributable to alcohol drinking. In short, it's often called PAF. So if we see then, for example, here 4.5 overall globally, if we make that in average, around 4.1% of all cancer globally are related to alcohol drinking. This is around 740,000 cases, which is a lot. If you imagine you reduce it by half, we already save half of the 700,000 people. And then where then we see then that the proportion of cancer linked to alcohol largest, as it's really reflective of what is then the population level of drinking. So it's in really then North Europe, especially Europe, Russia, but as well as some countries, for example, like India, China, and then some Southeast Asian countries. It's very different between men and women, as I mentioned before. So in men, the number before we saw in average is 4%, but in men, it can be as high as 7.2% in, for example, Belarus. So again, it's a big number in terms of the total cancer that's happening in that country that can be linked to one substance. It's also then big in some other part of Eastern Asia. You see then also then in China, in India, and imagine then the size of this population. For women, then it's a bit different. The Asian countries is not as strong as before, but here then it comes, for example, Australia, as well as with other than European country, where then the contribution of alcohol is very important. I'll go very quickly then in terms of cancer sites. So esophageal cancer is then the most common cancer caused by alcohol. So 20% of all cancer that is linked to alcohol are esophageal cancer. After that, liver cancer. So there two combined, it's almost half of all cancer related to alcohol. And these two cancers have very poor survival. And then if we think after that, it comes then breast cancer and colorectal cancer. What I want to bring as a message at the end as well, when we do a lot of this communication, especially in countries such as France, the UK, we've been asked quite often, how can breast cancer is related to alcohol drinking? And then if we see this number, we see how important breast cancer is, for example, in the total cancer that is linked to alcohol. Globally, if we see it combined together, esophageal cancer, it is the most important cancer. But in some countries like here, France, breast cancer is 20% of all of the alcohol-related cancer. So it's really important. If we think of 20,000 cases of alcohol-related cancer in France, so then we're thinking of around 5,000 of all those cancers are then breast cancer among women. Very similar number than what we see then, for example, in the UK. Again, 24%. In the UK, we see then around 17,000 cases related to alcohol or caused by alcohol. A bit lower number, but it's a big portion at the end. So these are then the reports that I mentioned before that is now widely distributed in WHO. So you can find that using then, for example, this. It's also translated in other languages, for example, here then in Russia, in Russian, in French, and of course it's available in English. And then just to close up then this little presentation, so alcohol is an established cause of cancer. There's really no doubt in the relationship between alcohol and cancer. It causes 750,000 cases annually, so in a year, around 741,000 if I want to be more precise, and it has different multiple biological mechanisms, and therefore also many cancer sites. It's not only cancer within the digestive system, and this information is not widely known in the population. There is no safe limit for cancer and alcohol drinking and for cancer, and then because there's no safe limit, so only a small amount of alcohol drinking causes an important portion of cancer in the population. And we know, looking at the differences in countries, not only differences in alcohol drinking in countries, that there are effective strategies to reduce the population level of alcohol. It shouldn't be a personal responsibility, but there's a lot more that can be done at different levels to reduce an alcohol drinking in the population, and at the end, bringing down a big portion of burden of cancer in general. Thank you so much. I hope to hear then from you and your discussion, and looking forward as well to hear what the presentation of Terry, of course. Rosie.
No. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Isabel. As ever, you're an absolute mine of information, and I'm really sure that we'll have plenty of questions about that. So thank you so much for that really, really valuable insight. Now it's my pleasure to turn to our second speaker, Terry Slevin. Terry is a well-known face to many of us. He's served as CEO of the Public Health Association of Australia since 2018. He holds adjunct professorial titles from the Australian National University and Curtin University, and he's been working in cancer control and public health since 1984. And he doesn't mind me saying that, I promise. Terry, thank you so much for joining us today, particularly at a late hour for you. We've heard from Isabel about the magnitude of the harms that alcohol has on cancer, but we also need to recognise that that cancer is only part of this picture. So could you take a little bit of time and talk us through the broader evidence base that can support effective policies on alcohol control?
Sure. Thanks very much, Rosie, and thanks, Isabel, for such a sound foundation. I'll start by, excuse me, acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I'm coming to you from, on the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra in Australia. We think it's important to recognise the first Australians and the fact that the land that we're on, they've looked after for many, many, many generations, and we're very privileged to operate on Aboriginal land. I'll go to the next slide, Rosie, and we'll go firstly to the notion of the alcohol harms beyond cancer, and many of these are probably more widely discussed in society in your towns and cities where you live. But I guess from a big picture point of view internationally, we need to recognise that there's 3 million deaths each year globally attributable to cancer, and that makes up about 5% of the global burden of disease. And as you saw from Isabel's presentation, broadly, males are more likely than females to drink at levels where that kind of health burden occurs, and that disabilities and poor health also infect millions more people that are associated with alcohol-related harm, whether that's chronic disease, injury, accidents and the like. Single highest proportion of that harm or premature mortality occurs in young people, about 10% of premature deaths in people aged 15 to 49, 13.5% of people in their 20s and 30s. So it's a very substantial impact in terms of years of life lost. Even higher proportion of deaths and hospitalisations in disadvantaged and vulnerable populations, as they're defined in various ways through data collection and the way we categorise such issues. But I think it's also worth turning our mind to the fact that alcohol contributes to or causes more than 200 diseases or injury conditions in the way we conceptualise these things. So there's an enormous burden of harm that comes with alcohol consumption around the world. Next slide, please, Rosie. I guess the way of conceptualizing that I find useful is twofold. Firstly, talking about some of those immediate adverse effects, and some of those are unintentional or intentional injuries, including those due to road traffic crashes, family and community violence, suicide, a range of mental and behavioural health disorders, including alcohol dependence. A range of those very short and immediate adverse effects is often associated with episodic high-level consumption of alcohol. And these are the kind of things that affect towns and cities around the world and are well established and understood and known. And it's one of the reasons that we've always wrestled with the issue of how to manage alcohol in any society in which it's played a role. Then the second and often less recognised impact of alcohol consumption is a chronic effect, and it's a chronic adverse effect as a result of consumption that occurs over long periods of time. And the simple way of thinking about this is on a dose-response effect over lifetime. That is, the higher the consumption over a lifetime, the higher the level of risk of those various chronic adverse effects. Major non-communicable diseases, and last week we recognised the importance of NCDs around the world, such as liver cirrhosis, the cancers, as Isabel's clearly pointing out, cardiovascular disease, and a range of other adverse effects. And I guess one of the other things worth pointing out is also the fact that I'm not sure we adequately capture and report the impact of alcohol and its contribution to caloric intake, that is, the kilojoules, the energy in alcohol, and how that's captured and how it contributes to obesity-related chronic conditions. But that's, I guess, another methodological question to wrestle with. Also, incidents or outcomes of infectious diseases such as tuberculosis and HIV have been associated with alcohol. And of course, we know the terrible adverse effects of alcohol consumption when it comes to the unborn child. Fetal alcohol syndrome and preterm birth complications are another devastating lifetime adverse effect of alcohol consumption when that consumption occurs in the pregnant mother. Next slide, please, Rosie. But of course, when we do talk about alcohol consumption and health effects, it's always raised with us. And the simple question put, but doesn't alcohol prevent cardiovascular disease? It's probably a simple way to summarise this as being an absolutely overblown myth that's been aggressively and systematically marketed by the alcohol industry. Yes, my epidemiological friends have an ongoing methodological debate about the extent to which alcohol might have some modest preventive effect in very low levels of consumption in some populations. But that small window that suggests there may be some beneficial effect of alcohol consumption with regard to cardiovascular disease is exploited in a most ruthless and systematic manner by those who sell alcohol, so as to create the perception, and they've done so very successfully, that alcohol consumption might be the cure to all of our cardiovascular disease ills. In fact, the reality is, and here's the World Heart Federation in their report on the impact of alcohol consumption, puts a simple infographic in their report, and you can check the full detail of the report, that says alcohol consumption increases the risk of many cardiovascular diseases. So put some data in there, both from the Global Burden of Disease report from 2016 that talks about the unfounded conclusion there is no beneficial individual level effect of alcohol consumption. The detrimental effects at the population level far outweigh the beneficial effects. So it's absolutely the case that there's still a very active and raging methodological debate amongst epidemiologists about the impact of alcohol with regard to cardiovascular disease. There's broad acceptance of higher levels of consumption, absolutely increasing risk of cardiovascular category of diseases such as stroke, peripheral artery disease, coronary heart disease and the like. So it's important to understand that the broad and oversimplified assumption that a glass of wine will prevent cardiovascular disease is at very, very best an outrageous oversimplification and exaggeration, and at worst a simple myth. And I think there's a legitimate notion that we need to be conscious of that this is a myth that we need to bust and be prepared to tackle, and because it will undoubtedly come up in the kind of policy debates that we'd want to participate in. Next slide, please, Rosie. But of course, when it comes to taking action with regard to alcohol, there's a whole range of sectors as a result of the kind of burden of disease that we talked about, who would have common cause with us if we seek to take that next step of trying to have a public health impact with regard to alcohol consumption and the various adverse effects. So if we accept the fundamental premise that Isabel has articulated so effectively, that alcohol consumption is a known carcinogen and contributes substantially to the burden of cancer, then we'd want to prevent those cancers. But in so doing, we have the prospect of also preventing a whole range of other adverse effects. And people in the police and law enforcement areas, people in domestic and family violence, people who are interested in reducing the adverse effects of accidents and emergency responders, health insurers, addiction specialists, road safety advocates, even religious and cultural groups are our allies when it comes to public policy with regard to alcohol. So alcohol causes cancer. Let's go back to that question and ask the question, who knew? And one of the points on one of Isabel's final slides makes the observation that it's under-recognised with regard to its contribution to cancer causation. So having a look around at the various sources of data on that, various estimates ranging from less than 10% to at the very best 50 or 60% in various data sources were identifying in an unprompted manner, that is, people were consciously aware of the link between alcohol consumption and cancer. So there's been various studies around the world that have made these various estimates. One from a French population in 2010 suggesting that 60% acknowledged, and I suspect by the methodology were actually prompted, that is, do you believe that alcohol causes cancer, rather than being invited to list the things that people were aware of that they knew contributed to cancer risk. And so data from my own country, some surveys I've been involved in, and other colleagues putting those figures around. In one survey in 2012, about 36%, another survey most recently in Victoria in an unprompted manner, 19% of drinkers linked alcohol with cancer consumption in an unprompted survey question. Next slide, please, Rosie. And so let's have a look at the data. And here's a survey recently done by the American Institute for Cancer Research, and this is a regular survey that they do every couple of years. And when people are asked to identify a range of cancer risk factors, which were the ones that people said, yes, that does cause cancer? And I've collected data of this kind myself in the past as well. And this is very familiar to the kind of results that I was getting more than 10 years ago here in Australia. So you can see issues like radiation, tobacco, inherited or predispositions to cancer, industrial pollutions, and so on. They're all ranking very highly, in the 80s and 90% of people identifying those as being cancer causative agents. And if you look in the second column, you'll find alcohol, and it identifies there about halfway down that second rung. About 45% of people in this survey in the USA identified alcohol as contributing to cancer, and there's a bit of an uptick of that from the previous data collection in 2017. So you can see it's fair way down the pack when it comes to those issues where people identify immediately the link between alcohol and cancer causation. But I mentioned earlier, and next slide, please, Rosie, that there has been quite a bit of work done here. And in the earlier slide, Australia was one of the countries that was recognised as a slightly higher level of recognition of this connection. And that's no accident. There's been a number of campaigns that I and others have been involved in that tries to draw people's attention to this simple epidemiological evidence that we know has been accumulated substantially over the last 20 or 30 years. The one on the left, the Glass Baby, as it's called, is a campaign that was run in Western Australia, where I lived for 26 years, and this has only recently been run. And this is an evaluation of that campaign that was published only last week. And this campaign resulted in a large majority of reported increased concern about drinking during pregnancy, and 85% of people surveyed after the first wave of the campaign identified that, who are mostly female responders, also reporting being much likely to use alcohol during pregnancy. So these campaigns can establish that kind of behavioural intention. That one obviously related specifically to alcohol and its causation, adverse effect on the unborn child. But the one on the right-hand side, the rather graphic image of the woman and identifying the various locations where cancer causation is associated with alcohol consumption, was run by the Alcohol Think Again campaign by the Western Australian State Government. I was involved in the evaluation of that now more than 10 years ago. And our early evidence of that suggested that there was a substantial proportion of people who both firstly increased their recognition of the link between alcohol and cancer, and then secondly made a difference in terms of their alcohol consumption intentions. So through the kind of campaigns that we've seen in the tobacco area and other areas of cancer prevention in the past, we do know that we can change the perception, the views of the community by presenting evidence-based information about a simple health effect that we have known about and have strong scientific evidence to support. Next slide, please, Rosie. Rosie, have I still got you? There you are. I mentioned the red wine effect, and that campaign in particular specifically used red wine in its graphic imaging as an illustration of the extent to which alcohol contributes to cancer risk. But you'll see in this slide, when data we collected back in 2012, we asked people which of these things increase cancer risk, and we presented a list like the survey that came from the American Institute for Cancer Research. A range of potential causative factors include some inert factors that had no cancer association with them, just to test the extent to which people were just saying, oh, everything causes cancer. But when we broke it up into not just alcohol, but various specific beverage types, we saw there was a variance in the perception of the various beverage types. And here you can see that alcohol was broadly more readily linked to cancer outcomes, beer less so, and red wine even less the case. And in that case, because it was an option available to respondents, 24% of people still reported that red wine reduced the risk of cancer. So that notion of red wine being preventive for cardiovascular disease had a halo effect with regard to its potential impact on cancer for a quarter of the survey population. So you'll appreciate that influencing the public perception on these things is not easy and takes concerted effort. But we did demonstrate that campaigns of that kind could, in fact, shift the public perception with regard to that association between alcohol and cancer, and also have an influence with regard to people's drinking intentions. Next slide, please, Rosie. So, why would we bother running these campaigns? Is it just to change people's behaviour? Or is it also about moving people towards being more favourably disposed towards the kind of policy settings that we know will have an influence with regard to alcohol consumption? And I'll list some of those later. But if we see two beneficial effects of effective health communication programs on cancer prevention, the first is to give people the fundamental right of knowledge about what science knows with regard to cancer causality. But the second one is probably even more important, and that is the extent to which people will support in a democratic environment public policy changes that a government might introduce for the purpose of reducing alcohol consumption. If they know there's a harm associated with alcohol consumption, in addition to the ones they're already aware of, they may be more favourably disposed towards public policies that actually address that issue. And here's data published from 2015 reinforcing exactly that. the more that those people in the survey who are aware of the link between alcohol and cancer were also significantly more likely to support public policies that would drive down demand for alcohol consumption. Also, not surprisingly, the level of consumption the individual reported also had an effect upon their perceptions with regard to those public policies. That is, the more they drink, the less they're in favour of policies that would be more likely to drive down their consumption behaviour. Next slide, please, Rosie. So I guess there's a really important fundamental psychological element to this at a population level, and that is, if we think broadly about the notion of, when we do as I say, not as I do, if you think of yourself as a parent, the best thing you can do for your children is model appropriate behaviour in whatever sphere it might be, whether it's education or good manners or how you sit at the table or whatever else. If you model the appropriate behaviour, children are more likely to follow. But broadly, as humans, we take more attention to what people do rather than what they say. So if, as cancer organisations, we advocate for public policies that control alcohol consumption, and yet we use alcohol as a means of raising funds, and there are some examples there of what was referred to in the report as pink washing, alcohol as a means to attract fundraising, cause-related marketing deals with alcohol companies and the like, and pink ribbon around alcohol containers. Or we as individuals and what influence our own drinking behaviour has with regard to these issues. These are very fundamental drivers of human behaviour, and we are far more less likely, if you like, to reduce alcohol consumption or encourage other people to, if we perceive ourselves to be substantial drinkers. Next slide, please, Rosie. I'll rattle off a couple of these, and I mentioned there are a whole range of very strong evidence-based policies with regard to the reduction of alcohol consumption. The first is particularly taking the foot off the accelerator of alcohol marketing. Controlling or regulating the marketing of alcohol is a proven means of reducing alcohol, particularly in young people. If we reduce availability, that's going to make a difference. That is, like liquor licensing hours, where and when alcohol isn't available, and to what sections of the society, and particularly restricting access to children. Enacting appropriate driving policies, that is, banning people from driving motor vehicles while they're intoxicated. Reducing demand through taxation, as we've successfully done in tobacco, for example, pricing mechanisms being important for driving down consumption. We're seeing that in sugary drinks as well. And then the kind of campaigns that I was talking about, awareness raising at a consistent level that is at sufficient dose to ensure the population are exposed to it. Ensuring support for these effective alcohol policies is fundamental to trying to tackle the alcohol-related harm that we know exists. So those are the kind of policies we want to support. Next slide, please, Rosie. But we can never forget that there are multinational alcohol companies, and these conglomerates can control a huge number of the brands that we see in our shops and the like. And these are multi-billion-dollar international businesses. These are companies that won't lightly take a reduction or any kind of controls on their sales. Now, I'll finish up with the next slide and the final slide saying, what is the special role for people who are cancer advocates with regard to alcohol control? And here's my 5 key lessons. The first is that campaigns work, and we need to tell people what we know about the evidence about alcohol causing cancer, and people in the cancer world are best placed to do that because we are seen as credible sources of information. The second is no hypocrisy. Ensure our organisational internal policies, whether it's on catering or fundraising or the kind of partnerships that we establish, reinforce and reflect that position. We don't buddy up with the alcohol industry because it suits our finances and then try and get across the message that alcohol contributes to cancer risk. The third is to support and reinforce those evidence-based policies that we know have been proven to be effective in various places around the world. The third is to collaborate and join forces with other people with a common interest with regard to reducing alcohol-related harm. And the fifth is be prepared for a fight, because we know the alcohol industry isn't going to roll over and play dead. There's multi-billion-dollar interests in this field, and they will use their political muscle to prevent at every turn any controls on their commercial interests. Rosie, I'll finish it there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Terry. That was great. And I think it's really sort of beautifully teed up the second session that we're going to have in this series, which is going to be talking about some of those policy options. So you've created a fantastic segue for us. We've had a few questions in the chat box. And so in the last sort of few minutes, I'd like to pose two questions to you, Terry and Isabel. The first is kind of focusing a bit more on the evidence base, and Terry and Isabel, you both talked about some of the methodological challenges. We saw in a global burden of disease study probably about a month or so ago now, there was some suggestion that actually some level of consumption might be sort of safe with regards to cancer risk above the age of 40. And obviously that kind of runs counter to the message that you both provided, that there's no safe level of consumption. So how is it that you'd like to see the cancer community responding to that? You know, what is it we can do where we have those moments of confusion?
Well, that publication has caused a lot of discussion also here in IR, but also with a lot of colleagues globally. And then I think there's another paper that came out then from the same group. It didn't really rectify for it, of course, but published then something a bit different in terms of that alcohol discussion that is more accepted. Overall, I think we all have to be then unified in terms of our messaging, especially health, public health and messages. Because if I hear a lot of people now, just lay people, even myself, this contradictory messaging brings a lot of harm, and at the end put a lot of distrust into academic, scientific, but also into governments. And that's really, really important if we want to make a difference. Making sure that we are unified, having this one single message, and therefore more discussions between then the scientific communities, but also then the different communities who are working in this topic is really, really essential, because it can be, I'm completely into transparency, into then of course having open science, but it can have a lot of damages if we are not working together better in this.
Fantastic. Thank you, Isabel. Terry, was there anything you wanted to add to that one?
Oh, I think I did an exercise at a UICC conference a few years ago comparing all of the alcohol drinking guidelines across a number of countries, and what was clear was there was an extraordinary level of diversity about the advice being provided by various health authorities. I think from a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, the smartest thing for cancer people to do is to contribute to the discussions about the alcohol drinking guidelines from your various health authorities, to ensure that the data that Isabel was presenting about the contribution to cancer is taken into consideration when the recommendations are being made about what is considered a safe drinking guideline for the populations you serve.
And can I, Rosie, take add into that? We know that there are differences in terms of population level of drinking, and it's different, for example, in different countries. In some country, it's a certain social group. In some countries, certain part of the country. In France, in the north of France, and then I just see here in Nigeria, it's again the same northern part of Nigeria. I'm all into subnational or subpopulation assessment of the data. So then policies can target then specific group better and then look into what can be done. But this single messaging of alcohol damage on cancer or other health impact has to be as consistent as possible.
Fantastic. Thank you both. So we've had a couple of questions talking about, you know, once we have these alcohol policies in place, how long does it take to produce an effect when it comes to sort of reducing risk. And there's sort of two questions, one looking at cancer risk more generally and one looking at FASD. Would either of you guys like to respond to that one?
I can, Terry, do you want to first then go and then I can do on the
Sure.
cancer?
The answer is very simple. Preventing cancer takes a long time and it takes decades. It doesn't matter which cancer you're looking to prevent. If you think about tobacco control, the reduction in lung cancer follows after some decades of tobacco control, and alcohol will be the same. However, in the outside of the cancer world, FASD, for example, if you stop a pregnant mother drinking during the gestation of the child, then the adverse effects are achieved in less than a year. So it depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. But from a cancer point of view, we know cancer prevention is a generational game. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I think the same, we need to work together. Alcohol drinking is not only harmful on cancer, and then we need to look into the gains, into the arguments on it, not only focusing on cancer, and work together with multiple stakeholders. In terms of accident, for example, it can decrease in terms of traffic accident much faster, and a big gain as well. So thinking of it really in the long term. So not only short term for whoever the policymakers who need that, but look, you also have a really long-term gain if you were then to change some of the policies in the country. Fantastic.
Thank you very much to both of you, and mindful of the fact that we are rapidly approaching the hour. I think that's a great point to sort of finish on. We have a very, very clear message as the cancer community that we have no safe level of consumption when it comes to your cancer risk. And also that our policies are in common, and that actually what we need to do is work better with other communities to, as you say, Isabel and Terry, realise those benefits over the life course of a policy, and also populations as well. So while it's going to be a difficult issue, that feels a nice hopeful point to sort of sum up the conversation on. So it only leaves me to thank you both very much for taking the time to provide such fulsome and such interesting presentations. I wanted to quickly reiterate the presentation's been recorded, and as far as possible, we'll try and make all those resources available to you, and we'll send that through to you directly to everyone who registered. We'll also provide the links to some of the reports that Isabel and Terry mentioned. And my final moment is to quickly flag with everyone that this is the first in a series, and we'll have a second discussion focused specifically on the evidence-based policy options, and that'll be taking place on the 28th of September. We encourage you all to register for that, and our final session in this series will also feature Terry and Isabel, and will be taking place at the World Cancer Congress on the 18th of October. So we very much hope you're able to join us there, and wish to thank you all very much for joining us today. Very much appreciate it, and look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. Thank you so much.